BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Ned heads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Tuesday, and on Tuesdays I've been talking to you guys about the case of JonBenet Ramsey, perhaps the most famous unsolved mystery in American history. And in this episode, I will be outlining the theory that an intruder was responsible for JonBenet's murder. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about the story of JonBenet Ramsey. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Box Ned. Now, as far as the topics for this episode were concerned, I polled you guys and I asked, what would you like to hear about for the Tuesday show? Would you like to hear about the intruder theory, which is something that I do support? The longtime listeners of BBOR will remember that I've said this for a very long time, that I believe an intruder was responsible. And I made one episode previously about the intruder theory, but it was very disorganized and all over the map. So I had been contemplating making a new episode where I just did the bullet points, got straight to the issue, and laid everything out more clearly. But I was also realizing that I've never done a standalone individual episode on John Ramsey as a suspect in the murder of JonBenet, and there are a lot of claims that people have made. And there are a lot of observations that people have about John Ramsey's involvement in his daughter's murder. So I polled you guys and asked what you wanted to hear about. And some people were wondering, well, why not talk about Patsy Ramsey? Why not talk about Burke Ramsey? And the honest answer is, I have standalone episodes about both of them here on this channel. But at this time, you can give your honest feedback. You can share anything you have to say about the case of JonBenet. And maybe it will be worked into a future episode of Black Box Online Radio. But I polled you, and you guys wanted to hear more about the intruder theory, and I think that there's a certain reason for that. As I've already said, this is a claim that I do genuinely defend. This is what I think happened, and I will go through it step by step with you. And you can just let me know where I'm wrong, let me know what makes sense to you, what doesn't make sense to you. Anything is fair game in the comments section, as long as it's done respectfully to the victim. Now let's look at the points. JonBenet Ramsey was last seen alive on December 25th of 1996. Her parents put her to bed, and she was found dead in the family home in the wine cellar in the basement on December 26th of 1996. At some time after 5 a.m. on December 26th, Patsy Ramsey went downstairs, and she found the 2.5-page ransom note that said that somebody had taken JonBenet. They wanted $118,000 in exchange for her return, or she would be beheaded and never see 1997. The ransom note said that there were 3 perpetrators, the person writing it and 2 men who were watching over JonBenet. The ransom note was directed to John Ramsey, not Patsy Ramsey, but she's the one who found it. She alerted John. She also called 911, and the authorities became involved. All right, that's the introduction. What is the case for an intruder? Now, most people who believe that an intruder was responsible for JonBenet's murder think that the intruder entered the house at some time during the Christmas party that happened on December 25th, and then the intruder would have had 1 to 4 hours alone in the Ramsey house when they could have put their plan together. I believe that this was a plan to kidnap and murder JonBenet, but not necessarily in that order. You have the primary motive and you have the secondary motive. The primary motive was to murder JonBenet. The secondary motive was the kidnapping. She was someone who was eyed down by a predator who had thought about the fantasy of murdering her over and over again. It was a murder plan as well as a sexual assault. Someone developed a type of obsession with JonBenet. Now, a big point of contention is a lot of people, even the detective Lou Smith, believed that the intruder entered the house through the basement window and then also exited the house through the basement window, but I don't necessarily think that that's what happened. As other people have pointed out, there were multiple entry points that were unguarded, and this also might suggest that there was somebody who had very close and personal knowledge of the Ramsey's house, who knew that there would not be a dog there, who knew that the alarm system was not enabled, I once heard in an interview with John Ramsey that the alarm system was not enabled because it went off once and it actually really hurt JonBenet's ears, so he disabled the alarm system. That is just going off of memory, but there's a certain irony in that. So somebody had very strong familiarity with the Ramsey household. John Ramsey also said in a different interview that he thought it was a safe neighborhood and that it wasn't abnormal for them to leave doors and windows unlocked. Well, that also turned out to be very untrue. So the intruder enters the house perhaps through a window or an unlocked door, maybe even an unlocked door, and at this point, they have that primary motive to murder JonBenet and to make it look like a kidnapping. I mean, it is a real kidnapping. It's just they wanted the parents to think that the intention was to collect ransom. The intruder never wanted the ransom. The intruder never wanted $118,000. That was all a diversion. This person had the plan of murdering JonBenet and then taking her body out of the house. Now, this is what is in the perpetrator's mind before they've gone in. Once they're in the house, again, for 1 to 4 hours, they began improvising, or maybe they decided to alter their plan. Both of those things would have had to have happened no matter whom your suspect was. Whether your suspect is one of the Ramseys or an intruder, that has to be the case, because all of the items that were found were from the Ramsey household. Either they altered their plan or they began improvising on the spot. And then the intruder is waiting, again, for maybe 1 to 4 hours. Have you tried to just sit still for 4 hours? It's very intense. The intruder then took Patsy's paintbrush, broke it, took a piece of rope or cord from the home, and then made that into the garrote. They had the duct tape ready that they found in the house. They put the plan together. They were even planning on putting JonBenet's body into the suitcase. And I think you guys want to hear more about the hard evidence as opposed to just the layout for the intruder thing. And I'm going to be citing the District Attorney Mary Lacey, as well as Lou Smith's investigation. And the first is that the most famous one is that DNA evidence was found on JonBenet's body that did not belong to any of the Ramseys. The Ramseys provided hair, pubic hair, blood, and saliva samples, and there was still DNA from an unknown male perpetrator. Touch DNA was found on her long johns or leggings, and DNA was found on the waistband of her underpants, and also DNA was found underneath her fingernails. There were also 2 spots of blood, according to the District Attorney Mary Lacey, that contained DNA from an unknown male. And then the skeptics of this theory claim that, now wait a second, those 2 spots of blood contain a mixture of DNA, JonBenet's DNA, the unknown male, and a third unknown individual. So I think that that is not a challenge to the intruder theory. That actually supports and strengthens the intruder theory. Next, according to Lou Smith's report, there was a palm print that was found on the basement door that did not belong to the Ramseys, and also a metal baseball bat was found with fibers from the basement that was located outside of the Ramsey house in a place where children wouldn't normally play. Next, there was also a packing peanut that had been tracked into the house from the outside, which would suggest that the intruder, you walked through a place that had packing foam peanuts that were found outside, and then they tracked one in when they were trying to go to the basement, which would not have happened when the Ramseys went up and then, of course, took off their shoes and went to bed the way that they normally claimed, or the way that they claimed after the Christmas party. So as far as how all of this would have gone down, there's going to be one point that I'm still undecided on. One could be that JonBenet is asleep at the Christmas party, or she falls asleep on the way home, and John Ramsey is carrying her. He says the last time he saw her alive is when he carried her up the stairs, put her to bed, and she was wearing a red turtleneck when she went to sleep, and then the intruder could have walked up the stairs, again according to Mary Lacey's report, sat down on the 2nd floor, and this created an impression in the rug that was completely unaccounted for with the movements of the Ramseys, and the District Attorney Mary Lacey stated that it appears that the intruder came up from the basement, sat down on the rug, and waited to make sure that everyone was asleep before entering JonBenet's bedroom. And then at that point, the intruder does something to JonBenet, incapacitates her, and silences her. She could have been hit on the head. A stun gun could have been used, although I don't support the stun gun theory. And then she is taken to the basement, and this is where the intruder sexually assaults her with the paintbrush, and the plan is to put JonBenet's body into the suitcase and transport her out of the house. This was a sexually motivated murder, a premeditated murder. But what happened was, JonBenet was either too large for the suitcase or she was just unable to fit. So this person abandoned the plan and then just decided to leave. Now, somebody brought up this point about, well, if they didn't want to bring her out of the house anymore, why did they keep the ransom note there? Why did they leave the ransom note if obviously this wasn't a kidnapping? Well, there are two reasons for this. One of them is the ransom note still could have served as a diversion, and if anything, it's a more confusing diversion now. And the second one would be perhaps their priority was just getting out of the house. I think both of those things are true. The ransom note is still a diversion, and the perpetrator was also just trying to get away as quickly as possible. Another piece of evidence. There was a high-tech boot print that was found at the scene of the crime. And by high-tech boot print, I mean it had the letters HITEC as words that were written on the sole. And this has not been matched to anybody in the Ramsey family. I've read countless times that it was John Ramsey's high-tech boot print. I've read that it was Burke Ramsey's high-tech boot print. I've never found a corroborating or supporting piece of evidence for that. Okay, the thing that I'm mostly divided on is whether or not JonBenet ate the pineapple by herself. JonBenet had undigested pineapple in her system, yet her family said that she was asleep during the car ride and they brought her up and put her right to bed. One thing I thought about was JonBenet could have awakened while she was in bed and her parents didn't know. She went downstairs and the bowl of pineapple was on the table. She just reached, put one in her mouth, and then went back to bed. Kids do things like that, and this was really my go-to theory for a while, because some kids are very restless, they're not strong sleepers, they don't sleep very soundly throughout the night. One thing that I even tried to think about was, and I know that I'm going to get a lot of backlash for this one, but it is that the intruder could have seen the pineapple in the bowl, taken it upstairs, put his hand over JonBenet's mouth, and then she's like, "What's going on?" And he offered her the pineapple as a way to try and keep her silent, puts his finger to his lips and says, "Shh, be quiet," something like that. And then, after she took the pineapple, she was still about to make noise, so he hit her on the head, and then took her downstairs. Okay, I want to hear all of your challenges, and I want to hear all of the responses. And I want to be clear that I am citing Lou Smith's report and comments that were shared via Crime Library, and mostly these are interpretations of his comments from the report, and I'm also citing an interview that Mary Lacey did with ABC News, which again was shared via their website. Mary Lacey was the DA who exonerated the Ramseys in 2008. I also have a lot of genuine concerns about why people are choosing to vilify the Ramseys, and the way that they construct their theories. And I think I might as well get to one of the most famous and widely discussed ones, and that is that Burke did it. That Burke Ramsey hit his sister in the head in a dispute over pineapple. There's, of course, the famous story about Burke hitting JonBenet with a golf club, and then there is the story, you guys know it, that Burke was eating pineapple and milk at the kitchen table. JonBenet reached in and stole a piece of his pineapple. Burke already had violent tendencies, and he started chasing JonBenet. He was just mad that she had done something, to provoke him, and he lost control. He grabbed a blunt object, maybe a flashlight, and hit her on the top of the head. And then he realizes, oh no, I went way too far, and Burke is actually feeling bad about this. Then he grabs a piece of his toy train set, the train track, and then stabs JonBenet in the side to try and revive her. And when she doesn't revive, he goes to his parents. He's just crying and pleading, and they're like, "We've already lost JonBenet, we don't want to lose Burke too," so they stage the scene. This is ridiculous to me. You're telling me that parents would not make sure that their child was actually dead. It was the strangulation that killed JonBenet, the asphyxiation, that parents are going to look at this situation and think, well, my son just hit my daughter with something, not calling 911, not calling an ambulance. No, we're going to strangle her to death. That's your answer? I have to play the plausible deniability card. I genuinely do not think that that's what happened, that Burke hit JonBenet with something, and then both parents covered it up. Now, there is one exception to that, and that is that John Ramsey was a high-profile businessman, the head of Access Graphics. They just hit the billion-dollar sales mark. He had the $118,000 bonus, and that was even mentioned in the ransom note, $118,000. And John Ramsey was thinking, oh, I'm a high-profile businessman. I can't have a son who is a killer. This will destroy my image. All right, maybe. But the whole theory about John and Patsy covering up because they didn't want to lose Burke too, implausible, and I just have to deny that completely. The next claim, the one that people think is just that Patsy Ramsey was responsible. Patsy did it. That she just snapped and she hit JonBenet because of a dispute over bedwetting. That's why JonBenet's clothes were changed. Detective Steve Thomas just took this to the entire bank. He wrote a book about this. He went on national television saying that he resigned from the police force because they weren't looking closely enough at Patsy Ramsey. He wouldn't go into detail about this. He appeared on Larry King Live, and he confronted the Ramseys, and they told him, well, tell us what happened. This is, again, Larry King's interview with Detective Steve Thomas, and he wouldn't elaborate on the details, but he did say he thought that JonBenet did something, and Patsy just snapped and hit her on the head. Then she staged the scene, covered it up, wrote the ransom note. It's the same problem. A mother's not going to make sure that her child does not have any signs of life before she ties a rope around her neck and strangles her? Ridiculous. I just don't believe that that's what happened. And, I mean, there is evidence, as we've said, about the DNA evidence, as well as the palm print, the high-tech boot print. There is evidence to suggest that there was an intruder in the house. Now to the next point. You guys might want to hear some skeptical challenges to the interpretation of the evidence that I provided at the beginning. And that is that Lou Smith was perhaps the loudest voice outside of the Ramsey family for the Ramseys being innocent. But I have to admit that it seems like Lou Smith might have done this case a disservice. He has been very inaccurate with a lot of statements. He also makes very bizarre statements. This thing about the baseball bat being used as the weapon that struck JonBenet in the head, I have some major problems about that story, saying that there was a metal bat that was found in a place where kids would not normally play that had fibers from the carpet in the basement. Alright, my biggest problem with that is a place where kids would not normally play, and again in the write-up that I was citing, it said that Lou Smith did not go into detail. Well, of course not, because there's no place that kids don't normally play. I was 9 years old once. I was 6 years old once before the internet. Like Burke and JonBenet, there's no place that kids would not normally play. They're going to walk around to all parts of the property, no matter what, no exceptions, even if it's something off limits. And this thing about fibers from the basement carpet were found on a metal bat, all that means is that the metal bat was in the basement at some point. And was this not property of the Ramseys? I mean, if it wasn't, then that might be a different issue, but you guys might be wondering something. Okay, you found fibers from the carpet. How about blood? If this was used to strike JonBenet in the head, shouldn't there be blood evidence on this metal bat? But that was not even the first thing that I thought of. I was trying to find an illustration of JonBenet's head wound because I really don't want to use any of those skull depictions that have been shared online. And if you're listening to this on Spotify or Apple Podcasts under the name Black Box True Crime or Black Box Podcast, I hope that you'll check out the YouTube version. When you look at the impact that was made from the blunt object that hit JonBenet, I don't think that looks like a baseball bat. Lou Smith was a detective. I am not. He was a professional. I am not. but I would expect that a baseball bat would create a lot more shattering or fragmenting of the skull in a very clear line based on the shape of the bat. To me, that looks like a blunt object, or, I mean, like people have proposed the heavy flashlight like a mag light. I think that that would be something appropriate. Other people have talked about things like the square base of a trophy, but for an intruder, I think it would be more something like the flashlight or a club or some type, or just some type of baton, nightstick, or just some type of hard object that had either a circular or rectangular base. Whereas if somebody were to use a baseball bat, that would be considerably wider, and again, that would make a much more fragmented pattern on the skull. That is just what I think about that. And again, as I said, I think Lou Smith is really turning into somebody who's just making some very bizarre and confusing statements. Again, a packing peanut from outside was found inside. Well, maybe somebody else did that. I mean, maybe it went through that broken window in the basement and was blown in by the wind. I mean, again, all that means to me is that there was a bunch of packing peanuts that had been outside. One of them ended up inside. That doesn't necessarily mean that it was an intruder. That doesn't necessarily mean that the intruder brought that in. The things that are much more convincing to me are DNA evidence, like, again, the touch DNA on the long johns, touch DNA on the waistband of the underpants, DNA underneath the fingernails, and, the two spots of DNA that were found on her underwear are a little bit more questionable, only for the fact that they are not as widely discussed and appreciated by all of the forensic scientists, and they really do not come up a lot. But again, I'm citing Mary Lacey's interview with ABC News as the source for that. That's one of the reasons why the district attorney believed that the Ramseys should be found not guilty. The next point, I would like to touch on something from a previous episode where I was responding to Pat Brown's psychological profile about the murderer of JonBenet, and she said something about the suspect Gary Oliva. And Gary Oliva is somebody who, has confessed to certain illegal activities. Let's just say that. And she said, he should not be a top suspect. He should never have been one of the prime suspects in the Ramsey case. And I'm sitting back and I'm thinking, well, you know what? Absolutely, he should have been a prime suspect at one point. Now, maybe not. Maybe the forensic evidence isn't pointing toward Gary Oliva. But Gary Oliva is the person who made a phone call to his friend named Michael Vale saying that, I heard a little girl. I heard a little girl. Allegedly, he made this phone call on December 27th of 1996. He was in Boulder. He had an obsession with JonBenet. He had hundreds of images of her. So if he did indeed do that, he should have been a suspect. Absolutely, you should follow up on a lead like that. And I mean, that is something that is worth exploring, even if you think that one of the Ramseys did that. If you had a sex offender who was in the area, who lived, completely within the realm of possibility in terms of distance, who confessed to hurting a girl in the area, then you should look into that lead. But more importantly, Gary Oliva reportedly did not say, I killed JonBenet, I hurt JonBenet. He just said, I hurt a girl, I hurt a little girl. No specific information was shared to Michael Vale in that phone call. And this might be something that I think Pat Brown was a little bit more spot on about when she said that one explanation for this that could solve everything is that Gary Oliva made up the story and Michael Vale got his dates wrong. Maybe it wasn't December 27th. Maybe it was some substantial time after that when the story could have been shared in the newspapers. Then Gary Oliva got wind of it and he fabricated the story about hurting a little girl. Now, he was a real sex offender, a real pedophile. He had a real obsession with JonBenet, but that's what she was arguing that Gary Oliva's motive was for the false confession. It's just, he wanted to be mentioned in the conversations with JonBenet. He wanted his photo next to hers on the evening news because it was some way that he could connect with her in his own twisted and disgusting way. Absolutely disgusting, because we also have to remember that John Mark Carr is just leading on people about being JonBenet's killer, although he didn't want to get captured the way he was, and then ultimately he was exonerated. So I think that those leads were worthy of exploration, but I don't think Gary Oliva murdered JonBenet, and I don't think John Mark Carr did. If anything, this is one where I would mostly agree with John Douglas, the psychological profiler, that JonBenet was murdered by somebody who had insider knowledge of the Ramsey household and a sexual predator who targeted and stalked the Ramseys for a period of time. This person wanted to kill and abduct JonBenet, to take her dead body, her lifeless body, out of the house, and they wanted to make it look like a kidnapping. People would always think that JonBenet had been kidnapped, not murdered, and it would just be an unsolved missing persons case for the rest of time. What they didn't account for was that it was actually much more difficult to get JonBenet out of the house. I think the killer wanted to put JonBenet's body into the suitcase, as evidenced by the fibers from her pajamas that were found in the suitcase. Then they wanted to put the suitcase through the basement window and transport it out. But then something about that plan went awry. It just turned out to be too difficult. Again, this is something that I think was either improvised or altered upon arrival to the crime scene. Now, to all of you guys who are like, Ned, what are you saying? You mean that this killer broke into the Ramsey household but didn't bring any real weapons that we know of, other than maybe carrying his own blunt object like a heavy flashlight or something, and that he used the Ramsey's own pad to write the ransom note? He used their own marker. He also used Patsy's paintbrush, was using their own suitcase? And my simple response would be, yes. Is that a common thing to do? Mostly no. I've even brought up some examples in the past, but overall, as somebody who runs a true crime channel, I am forced to admit that that is not a common occurrence. John Ramsey, though, was the one who said that if an intruder were to just grab items that he found around the house, then that would have fewer possibilities of the crime being traced back to him using the pad to write the ransom note. Well, if they had any paper pad in his house, that could be traced back to him. If he's using the Ramsey's pad, then there's no way to know who did that. It was just something that was found in the house at the scene of the crime before the murder. And I would like to conclude this episode with one follow-up from last week, giving a shout-out to YouTube user Matt M., who had a comment about the Deception Detective in his series of videos on JonBenet. I watched a handful of his episodes. He has numerous ones about the Ramsey case, and he is a believer that Burke Ramsey committed this crime and then the parents covered it up. I've already expressed my doubts about that, but Matt M. says, I can't stand the Deception Detective. He is charging $80 for a deck of cards. That is deception in and of itself. And I saw that on his channel. It's like he put this chart on the screen of tactics that you can use to spot deception in other people, and I'm thinking, oh, wow, I would actually like to have that chart. Yes, I want to know tactics on how you can spot deception in other people. Oh, but each tactic is written on a playing card, and then you have to pay $80 for the deck of cards. So then I'm thinking, I don't think so. I mean, most people just put that stuff online for free. You're charging $80 for something like that? That's a bit too steep. But the majority of what the Deception Detective does is look at statements that are abnormal, something that might suggest deception, something that might suggest that someone is not telling the truth. He's an attorney that specializes in statement analysis to, well, detect deception. And he did bring up one thing, though, that I thought was really interesting, and it was because he referred to it as a phenomenon. And that's just what it was called. It wasn't called a scientific fact. It doesn't mean that this person is lying. But he said when people are not telling the truth, they tend to create a fictitious story involving three people. And a clear example of this is the ransom note, saying that there is one person writing the note and there are two men watching over JonBenet. There are three kidnappers, but we know that JonBenet's body was found in the basement. I've also said that I think the ransom note was a fake. A dud, a hoax, all of that. You know it, I know it, everybody knows it. It was a hoax. But I mean, I think there's evidence to support that. And I was really glad that he presented it as a phenomenon. This is just something that happens. We don't have the clearest explanation why. It's like when people think about a number, they might think about the number 3 or the number 7 or the number 37. Lucky number 7, 3, Trinity. Like these things are just kind of ingrained in our thought processes. But almost everybody believes that the ransom note was a hoax, Nobody wanted to claim the $118,000, and that's where I stand on that. But as far as the $118,000, there's one variant of the intruder theory that the intruder enters the house. As I said, they have 4 hours in the house by themselves, and they found a piece of paper in the Ramsey's home that talked about $118,000. That's how they knew about it, for the ransom note. I don't like this at all. I don't like this claim at all. I think this person knew something about John Ramsey. I think this person was familiar with John Ramsey and his activities. This person did not like John Ramsey. That's why the ransom note is addressed to Mr. Ramsey, not Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey. And there's also just a very direct call out to John. I think it's also a plausible deniability issue where the intruder would have just found a piece of paper that said, hey, John Ramsey received $118,000 last February. Oh, I'm going to put that in the note. I don't think that's what happened, and most people who are listening to this program don't either. Now, the final point is, I've been talking a lot about the District Attorney Mary Lacey, who was involved with the exoneration of the Ramseys, and even though I believe that an intruder was responsible for JonBenet's murder, a different district attorney challenged her by saying she should not have exonerated them. The way you exonerate someone is by finding the perpetrator. They should have just found the real killer. If she thought that JonBenet was murdered by an intruder, well then the intruder should have been arrested, charged, going before the jury, convicted. That's how you would exonerate the Ramseys, and I agree completely. And I think that that's just the most defendable standpoint and the best interpretation and use of the law. You don't have to exonerate someone based on that. You can find the other perpetrator and then put them on trial. I would love to know your responses. And one thing that Mary Lacey said in her interview with ABC News was that the ransom note makes direct references to the movies Speed and Ransom. I mean, Ransom Note, right? The movie Ransom was a big deal at the time. I remember there was lots of publicity for this back in the 90s. And this is one that had the phrase, don't try to grow a brain. And some people say that there's also comments from the movie Speed that have been worked into the ransom note. So what Mary Lacey said was, what they should have done was go to the Boulder video stores and find out who had rented those movies, like Speed and Ransom and any of the other possible movie references that are contained in the note. Okay, I think that that goes into the category of it's not the most hurtful thing in the world. I mean, it's an idea. But it goes into the category of it's not the most hurtful thing in the world, but, or however, I can't guarantee what you will find. I mean, is that the only way to watch a movie? Renting it from a video store? How about the theater? How about watching movies in the theater? How about going to somebody else's house to watch the movie? How about borrowing someone else's VHS tape? The way that people did in the 90s. How about purchasing the VHS tape? Who's to say that they rented it from Blockbuster back in the 90s? Maybe they owned the movie Ransom or Speed. So I'm just thinking that that is not the most hurtful thing in the world, but I can't guarantee what you will find. And I have also one final point of venting, and this relates to an interpretation of the ransom note from the deception detective, when he said that it's so bizarre that in the ransom note, somebody is misspelling words like business, and there's the misspellings in the ransom note are just quite odd. It's almost as if somebody started out by faking their misspellings, pretending to be a foreigner from the foreign faction, then they forgot halfway through, so they went back to standard English. And I think people are making a mountain out of a molehill when it comes to the misspellings in the ransom note. I have a master's degree. I can't spell for shit. I'm not even joking. I mean, without the spell check, I am useless. I remember when I was 22 and I was talking to my cousin, and people would ask her how to spell words a lot because, she was a teacher and, she could spell everything correctly. And I was just like, I am so impressed and amazed at how you do this. I literally can't spell without the spell check. Not everybody is a good speller. Not everybody can spell words like business correctly. If you were to see me typing on Microsoft Word, you'd be almost just like laughing out of your seat at the words that I would misspell. Ordinary English words. So if anything, things worked in the opposite way. As we see with like the Zodiac Killer mystery, one standpoint that I do genuinely believe is the Zodiac couldn't spell words correctly, so he started making fun of it and playing a game with it, and blowing things out of proportion, making it look worse. with the JonBenet incident, I think this person was not perfect. They were a better speller than I am, I'll give them that, but misspelling a word like business, some people forget how many S's there are. End of discussion. All right, that's enough for this episode. I started out with the bullet points talking about all of the cases for an intruder murdering JonBenet, then, like I always do, going in all different types of directions. But if you would like to hear more about true crime cases on Black Box Online Radio, in addition to the JonBenet Ramsey episode, I am also going to be starting a series on the Black Dahlia, which will happen on Thursdays. The first episode will be coming out this Thursday to anyone who's listening to this live, and if you're listening to this at a future date, please check out some of my episodes on the Black Dahlia murder, the murder of Elizabeth Short. And if you have anything you'd like to say about the Black Dahlia murder, blackboxonlineradio at AOL.com, blackboxned88 on Instagram. And if you want to support all of these efforts, you can go over to buymeacoffee.com. Buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88 allows you to make a donation or contribution to help the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. That's all for me now. Until next time.